Hi, I'm Drew Levanti, and welcome back to Elections Weekly, a show where we journey through the week ahead with electional astrology. This week, I want to, first of all, take us through the week ahead at like a general level, talk about some of those themes. I also want to tell you about a presentation that I will be giving Tuesday evening as the moon conjoins my ascendant about Saturn. So if you're interested in hearing me talk about Saturn and love, the talk is called Saturn and Love. Check out the details at the video description or at the link in my bio and all my social media places, and you can attend. The talk is free. I'll be taking donations through a GoFundMe that is being organized by the Meetup group itself, and I'd love to see you all there. I'm really excited to share this stuff about Saturn and love. So before getting into the elections, I want to recap a successful election that one of our very special members of our community and what we're building here, Renee, used. This election was a Gemini rising chart with Mercury and Capricorn in the 8th house. The moon was in Gemini. And this was an election that Renee used for taxes and filing taxes, but also getting tax advice. And what ended up happening, according to Renee, is that this is like the fastest tax return that Renee has ever had. And it was incredibly efficient. And so I just wanted to shout out that success story from the comments. If you have a success story or a not success story, you know, we're open for any kind of feedback here because everybody will learn about what these charts can do based on your experience. So please feel free to also share any medium or little success stories, or even some things that you wish had gone differently, and we can kind of process that through the chart as well. So everything is welcome. I really mean that. I'm also booking a few more attunement sessions for March. So like I mentioned on the last video, I've got kind of a lot going on this month. So I'm limiting myself to approximately 12 attunement sessions, which is my signature natal chart offering through Astrology. So you can learn more about that at the links as well. So let's get into the charts for the week. Our first chart is going to give us a flavor of sort of the week ahead in general, because as we look at it, we're seeing a Scorpio moon here, and we're seeing a Scorpio moon that is in its waning phase. And so as we look at all of the charts for the week, all of them are going to have this waning moon. And as we move along through the week, the moon is going to be smaller and smaller, less and less light. And what this often connects with in terms of electional astrology is these are maybe things that don't feel so much like beginnings. They maybe feel more like continuations or closing things down. So if you're looking for something that has a lot of vim and vigor and optimism and like there's a lot of growth ahead of you, this week is probably not the week for you to be looking for elections because this moon is waning. Additionally, this moon is going to have some interesting contacts throughout the week. So we'll be paying attention to what aspects the moon is making, what its condition is, and where it is in the chart to flavor not only what that moon has to offer in that specific chart, but also what the general picture is through the week. What kinds of tides are we going to be riding as the moon makes different contacts? We're also going to notice that this week I'm highlighting some elections where we're drawing on some different techniques. We are expanding our toolbox a little bit to gain emphasis on specific planets that are doing really well. And you'll see what I'm talking about, but some of the elections you might be like, like I took a course on electional astrology. That doesn't look like something that I would have chosen given those rules. And I'll explain why I've done that and the additional rules and additional techniques that I'm kind of working with to bring this into play for us. So our first chart for the week is this Tuesday at approximately 10:15 a.m. here in my location. What's important about this chart is that it has Gemini rising. So in your location, you might have to adjust the time a little bit forward in order to have a Gemini rising. Just make sure that's the rising sign because we are focusing on Mercury for this election. We have this Mercury in Aquarius. Mercury has triplicity rulership in an air sign, technically at night only, but I often give Mercury some credit for being in an air sign regardless of whether it's a day chart or a night chart. We see this Mercury ruling the ascendant on the midheaven at this high point in the chart, which has so much to do with visibility, not only appearing in public, but also having eyes on a lot of different situations. A lot of times elevation can really help us see what's going on, understand the landscape that we're dealing with. And so when we talk about the authority of the midheaven or the authority of the 10th house, we're not only talking about gaining authority through our reputation necessarily, but also there's a visibility or a sense of activity around the chart that something on the midheaven has. So that's what this Mercury has access to, is these lines of sight around the chart that are giving it an ability to understand basically what's going on in a lot of different situations. And knowledge is power. The other reason that this chart has been chosen is because this is also, in my location, the planetary hour of Mercury. And so not only does Mercury rule the ascendant and it's on the midheaven, it also has this rulership of the planetary hour. And in the planetary hour, that planet gains extra emphasis and it gains an extra amount of say-so over what goes on. And so when we look at this Mercury, we're seeing an extra layer of support for this Mercury to get what it wants done. And that is you as Mercury. You are embodying Mercury. You're choosing to embody Mercury when you choose this chart. You might notice that the moon here is in Scorpio, and you might notice that the moon is also in a square with Saturn. And so when the moon is in such a condition like this, it's important to make it not responsible for a whole lot and to pay attention to what it is responsible for. So in this chart, the moon rules the second sign. It rules also the third house cusp. And so if you're dealing with either second or third house matters, this moon is going to be potentially problematic, not only because it's fallen, but also because it's squaring Saturn. And so this could show up in terms of resources feeling limited, or like your local or your intimate connections with people are a little bit strained at the moment. So if those things are descriptive of something that you're experiencing and you want to experience this mercurial spirit and to access that kind of mercurial power, then this is a chart for you, because you're tuning into both the challenges and the opportunities, right? And so by putting the moon in the 6th house here, what I've done is make the moon a little bit less emphasized. If we had a Taurus rising, for instance, then the moon square with Saturn would be more debilitating, because that angular position would just have so much more say-so in the overall outcomes of the chart. This is a pretty good chart for 4th house matters, because we see that the IC is in Leo. And so the IC is being ruled by the sun, the IC being the place that has to do with home, living situation, and place. So if we look at this sun, the sun is in the 10th, that is the 10th sign. It's conjunct the 11th house cusp, and it's conjunct Jupiter. And so this support that the sun already has by being unafflicted in the chart, you know, the sun does not have any debilitating aspects at all. It's actually being supported by this day chart Jupiter in its own sign. And so everything that the sun gets to touch in this chart gets a little jolt of that support as well. And so similarly, if we look at the 4th sign of the chart, then we're looking at Virgo. And so we look at Mercury. And Mercury is also the star of this chart. And so both 4th house and IC stuff are being supported here. And so you can see how I'm layering multiple house systems here. If you've been curious about how I work with that, you're getting a little bit of a glimpse into that. Our next chart for the week is February 23rd. It's Wednesday, and it is 10:15 a.m. And so again, we have another Gemini rising chart. You might be noticing that that is a theme this week. We are working with a lot of mutable rising signs. And what's so awesome about this chart, I will say this chart is way more awesome if you can have the moon in Sagittarius instead of in Scorpio. So for some of you Eastern Hemisphere folks, you will probably have the moon in Scorpio for this chart. And in that case, you're going to want to examine a different rising sign, because that's kind of missing the point of the chart. In my location, the moon is in Sagittarius, and the moon is therefore in a Jupiter-ruled sign, and Jupiter is, again, in the 10th sign, in the 11th house. And so when we look at the moon and the support that the moon has, it has support from this Jupiter. It has support from this beneficent 7th house party. And so this is a great chart where there's a combination of offering something and receiving something. because we see that this Jupiter is in a position to assist the ascendant because it has this overcoming square to the ascendant. And also the moon is in the 7th, so it's nourishing some kind of relationship situation. That could be professional, that could be personal, that could be simply intimate. And the reason I love this chart so much is because it's the hour of Jupiter. So we get another hit of Jupiter. Again, the planetary hour coming into play here. The planetary hour ruler is the ruler of the 7th. And so this gives the 7th house party more ability to, more capacity to assist us and to support us in Jupiterian ways by helping us expand and give us opportunities and all of these things. Unlike the Tuesday chart where the moon was a struggle a little bit, being in the 6th, being in Scorpio and ruling the 2nd in that chart, in this chart, the moon still rules the 2nd and it still rules the 3rd house cusp. And so this moon is therefore supporting those things because it has such a great condition in this chart where it has an aspect to Jupiter. And the moon, we'll notice, also has aspects to other things. So before it contacts Jupiter, it's going to touch the sun, it's going to touch Mercury, it's going to eventually go on to touch Saturn, although that aspect is out of orb. So we see this moon in the 7th being really busy. So there's a lot of connection happening across the ascendant descendant axis between these two people. And so that moon gets to make a lot of different connections. It will be tying a bunch of threads together, solidifying and completing some things that have been in the works for a while. And the reason I say this is because, again, we're dealing with the waning phase of the moon. So this moon moving toward the square with the sun, its 3rd quarter, or the 4th quarter of its phase, that is showing that there's a winding down here. There's a push toward completion. And so this 7th house energy that the moon is bringing is not only supportive in all the Jupiterian ways, but it's also at the end, or it sees the finish line. And so there's a push forward in relationships of some kind, a push to complete. And now we are on from Wednesday, the day of Mercury and Jupiter's hour, and we go to Thursday, Jupiter's day and Jupiter hour. And so this is another Jupiter chart, except this time we are not being Mercury, we are being Jupiter. And so the theme of generosity and abundance, and potentially in this case, working behind the scenes a little bit because there is this combustion that Jupiter is entering. And so when we're looking at Pisces rising charts for a while, or any time that Jupiter is ruling the ascendant, we want to take into account, like, what is this combustion, or what is this condition of Jupiter being hidden by the sun, being under the beams of the sun? What is that relating to in your situation? Is it that something is beginning again? Is it that there's this like new moon kind of energy around the way that you are forwarding yourself in this moment, the ways that you're seeking progress? Is it perhaps that you're simply doing something that is invisible? Is that invisibility of Jupiter under the beams of the sun connecting with some way in which you and your actions are also invisible? Now, while these themes of invisibility are possible, there is a strong emphasis on appearing in this chart as well, with the moon being in Sagittarius conjunct the midheaven. Now, fortunately, this is a chart where I'm pretty sure everybody in the world can get a Sagittarius moon. The only thing that's going to differ for you is what the next aspect of the moon will be. We see in my location that the next aspect of the moon is Saturn, which is in the 12th house. This makes it, for me, this will double down on the hidden quality of that Jupiter in the 1st house under the beams setting, actually. And so the moon in Sagittarius, if you have it in an applying aspect to Jupiter, that shows a lot more opportunity and a lot more reputation, these typical kinds of 10th house themes. And the moon here is nourishing something in the 10th house. And again, with the waning phase of the moon is helping bring something to completion in the 10th house and bringing the benefits of that reputation, the benefits of that public activity directly to the ascendant if the moon is applying to Jupiter. What is really cool about this chart additionally is that the Jupiter aspect of the moon is also a Mercury aspect of the moon. And so while with Pisces risings and now Mercury being in Aquarius, we have to be a little bit more careful about contractual or relationship-oriented elections when it comes to Pisces rising, because then Mercury is going to be in the 12th here. There are certain moments when we can highly mitigate that by having the moon connecting Mercury and Jupiter by aspect. So we see here that the moon is sextile Mercury and square Jupiter. So this is excellent for facilitating communication between people, even though they are not visible to each other. And one way that I've been thinking about this and the way that the moon and like seeing how this shows up in elections is that it can simply describe, especially with the essential dignities being factored in, where Mercury and Jupiter are both essentially dignified, this 12th house Mercury is not an enemy. It's just somebody who you can't see or you don't have physical access to. And so we need to take into account that when we're talking about houses, we also need to look at the whole picture. 12th house does not always equal bad. 12th house can simply mean a lack of contact, and how that lack of contact is actually playing out and how you are subjectively experiencing that is going to depend so much on the essential dignities involved and other factors within the situation that are specific to you. This also happens to be a Jupiter in its own decan and its sunrise. And so if you're interested in decanic talismans, this is one that does fit the bill for that. I haven't double checked or brushed up on my decanic talisman rules, but they are a thing and it only happens once a year. And this looks like a pretty good chart for it because the moon's in Sag. So if you're interested in exploring any of that, Picatrix is the main resource for elections of that kind that I'm aware of. Agrippa also has, Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy also has magical stuff on the decans. And we'll maybe be finding our way into some magical elections as we move along. But for now, I'm just sending that little note out there for you who might be interested. All right, our chart for Friday is about 12:06 p.m. And so we are looking at a Cancer rising chart. It's about 2 degrees of Cancer rising here in my location. And the moon is at 0 degrees of Capricorn, almost 1 degree of Capricorn here. Now, if you are looking at a Sagittarius moon in your location, for this one, that is perfectly fine. And the reason it's perfectly fine is because this chart is not about the moon. Every chart is a little bit about the moon, but this one in particular focuses on something else, and that something else is the sun. The sun is culminating. The sun is in the bounds of Venus, the Egyptian bounds of Venus, which I haven't done a video on, but I'm sure you can look up what those are. Dimitri George has great work on it. This sun is in the Egyptian bounds of Venus on the day of Venus, and this is the hour of the sun on Venus's day. So we have this really great layering of significations here where the sun is leading. You know, the sun is the king, right? And the sun is on the midheaven and it is doing things according to a very Venusian set of rules. So this specific subsection of Pisces is focused more on aesthetics and beauty and connection and all of these themes of Venus that bring us closer together. And so this sun is, although not essentially dignified, it has an incredible amount of support. And we see that with the conjunction with Jupiter, which is also in its own sign. And so in terms of what this election is for, you know, this one does lend itself more toward a devotional rather than an active kind of election, in my view. Certainly, it can be useful for showing up and doing all these solar things, doing reputational things. But the way that I would approach this election has a lot more to do with honoring the sun and honoring the way in which our solar functions, our solar capacities, our centeredness is necessary for connectedness. How having a heart that is grounded and rooted in confidence and that we know who we are, that is a really helpful energy to have when we're connecting with people, because then we don't ask for validation. We're not seeking anything that the other person is maybe not in a position to provide for us in a healthy way. And so the sun in this position, being about Venus, but also being very much about the sun, I'm thinking about this connection between solar and Venusian qualities and how the functions of those planets can be mutually supportive. And so if you have your own thoughts on the connection between the sun and Venus, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, or any ideas that you have about this election. Now, the moon does rule the chart, and it's in the 7th house as long as you do have a Capricorn moon in your location. And so that brings us again more to like a relational kind of dynamic here. So there's a way in which, even though this chart is focusing less on the moon and focusing less on the ruler of the ascendant, because we're focusing on the planetary day and hour, there is a way in which that initial layer reinforces these other layers. And so this is the chart for you, and this is how I'm thinking about it. Curious what your thoughts are as well. All right, our next chart is for Saturday, February 26th at approximately 5:58 p.m. We're looking to get Virgo rising, and I've put Jupiter right on the descendant. And so what this does in my location is that not only does it get Jupiter on the descendant, but it also puts Mercury in a trine with midheaven. And so this is pretty important for Mercury to get a little bit of its 6th house, duties to be recognized more clearly and to be appreciated, because the ruler of the ascendant in this chart, look, it's Mercury in the 6th house in a night chart with Saturn. And so when we think about the themes of that, there is it makes me think of being a TA or being like a research assistant where, you're connected with some scholar or I was just talking to my friend about, they used a chart like this, and it was literally, they didn't plan it, but they just sent it at a time when it was like they were trying to become like the advisee of some professor. And I thought that was so interesting because there is this Jupiter on the descendant. There is this, whether it's a scholar or a religious figure or a mentor of some kind, offering you advice, offering support and generosity. But at the same time, Mercury, the ruler of the ascendant, being in the 6th with Saturn, we're looking at a situation that has a lot more to do with like service and maybe being somewhat under-recognized, or like the research that you're doing is like really going toward somebody else's reputation, towards supporting somebody else. And how much of a recognition you get for that is going to depend on how friendly Saturn is to you, as well as how, with Saturn's influence on Mercury here, there's a question of endurance, like how long can you sustain this effort that you're putting here. And it also brings a seriousness to Mercury, where this might be something that does need to build up over a long time and that won't have like immediate feel-good responses to it, especially with the moon being in Capricorn, right? But the trine between Mercury and the midheaven does give that Mercury, that 6th house position of Mercury, a little bit of breathing room or a little bit of access to something that's going to get the recognition. And so that's an important aspect. And if you had to choose between making Jupiter angular and making Mercury trine the midheaven, I would definitely choose Mercury trine the midheaven. This also happens to be the hour of Mercury as well. This is the first hour of Saturday night. Saturday nights are ruled by Mercury. And so there's this doubling down of mercurial themes. And so that, in addition to the trine from Mercury to the midheaven, does give this Mercury quite a bit to hang its hat on, if you like. We do also see a lot here in the 5th house, with the moon conjoining Venus and Mars in the 5th house. So this is also a chart where themes of the 5th house could come into play. This could be something that you do really enjoy. And it makes me think of like a hobby becoming something that you do for work, right? Like this 5th to 6th house kind of dynamic, where the ruler of the 5th house is this Saturn that's in the 6th with the ascendant ruler. And so you can see how these themes of the 5th and 6th are really deeply connected. And it makes me think about hobbies that are not only professional, but maybe hobbies that are a little bit antiquated, a little bit old. So being into traditional astrology is certainly one way in which that can show up. But there's all sorts of other things. There's history. There's even things that some people will think are a little bit stuffy, like reading old books or reading, there's a studiousness to this chart that can be useful for a lot of those applications. It could also just be like a job application, that would also totally work for that. But I'm trying to explain these the specificities of this chart that maybe there's some kind of connection for you with. And our Sunday chart for the week, we are looking now at a noon chart. Wow, I haven't had one of those for a while. This is a timed chart. It's not just the noon chart. It is supposed to be at noon, and it's on Sunday the 27th. So as we look at this one, this is another one that, you know, when I was looking at elections for this day that were somehow like good elections, or like something that has to do with, you know, putting yourself out there, submitting something, applying for something, you know, these very like in the world kind of activities, nothing really hit. And when that's the case, I look somewhere else. And the place that I go is Planetary Hours. And so with this chart, this is a Sunday. And so this chart is the sun's day, and it is the hour of Jupiter. And we see that both the sun and Jupiter are culminating on the midheaven. So with this style of election, I am leaning more toward the devotional and toward the magical. Now, to be clear, this is not a petition. This is not asking a planet for something. This is not making a talisman. By God, this is not making a talisman. But this is something of a prayer. This is, I would say, a prayer for Jupiter. We see that Jupiter is going toward the sun, or rather the sun is going toward Jupiter. The sun is engulfing Jupiter in its rays. And so this period for Jupiter is about starting anew. And in order to start anew, you have to let go. And so what are those Jupiterian themes, whether it's teachers or beliefs or a religion or ideas and limitations that one might have on one's wealth mindset, for lack of a better word? Like, how abundant are you allowing yourself to be? And of course, this also involves structural, economic, and political structures and oppressions. But in the context of an election, and in the context of shifting one's consciousness in accordance with certain outcomes that we are seeking in a magical way, then what are those Jupiterian ideas or experiences that need to be somehow purified and somehow alchemized? So with that, you know, what is a prayer that you can write to Jupiter? What is something that you can tell Jupiter that you are grateful for, and something that you wish for Jupiter? What is something that you wish for Jupiter in this moment of its purification, and in this moment of it turning into something else and starting a new cycle? When it comes to the rest of the chart, you know, in my location, the moon is at 29 degrees of Capricorn, and the ruler of Capricorn is in the 8th sign, and the ascendant is ruled by this moon. And so there's really nothing else in this chart that I can speak to in terms of, here's what you should use this chart for. This is explicitly prayer-based, and so I hope for some of you that's useful. All right, now looking at our last chart of the week, it is Monday, and we are really getting into the balsamic phase of the moon, where the moon is on its last light, on its last legs. And so there is this winding down and this closing down. And so in my location, I've chosen a chart that reflects that closing down in multiple ways in order to have this beauty within the chart where multiple layers are speaking to similar things. And so with this chart, I have 28 degrees of Gemini rising at approximately 11:40 a.m., 11:40 a.m. in my location. And so by having a late degree rising sign like this, Mercury is ruling the ascendant here, it points to something being at its close as well. And so we have this waning moon, we have this late degree rising sign. Additionally, we have the moon and Mercury, the ruler of the ascendant, really declining from the MC. They are falling away from their height. And so there's a way in which this cadency, or this off the angle state that the moon and Mercury are in, is also about looking back. It's also about reflecting and closing down. And so here's another way in which that theme of this chart, that theme centered on the balsamic moon, is coming about. And that's all I'm going to say about this chart, because again, this this might be something that's decent for a career reputation. This might be like sending out a last message to a group of people who you've been working with, you know, this ending theme. And I hope that in this episode, you've seen a little bit more of like how I am actually looking at these elections. I feel like I've shown a lot more of sort of my technique. And so, yeah, this is what I do, y'all. I mean, there's more, of course, but I want to show you gradually more and more of how I work with this art. And I hope that you do see that it is artful and that we really are telling stories, we really are painting pictures, and we really are finding these alignments between multiple layers. You know, it's like in the rule of three, when we talk about the rule of three in astrology, where like if somebody's having a transit and somebody's having, you know, their secondary progressions are lighting up in a certain way, and then there's an eclipse that happens somewhere, like we need multiple significations or multiple signs pointing us toward this sense of truth, this sense of what is. And so that's how I work with elections. I am also looking for multiple layers. I'm looking for these beautiful moments. And so that is the vision that I bring to electional astrology. And if you would like to work with me for elections for yourself, I would love to bring this art and see what it can do for you as well. So love to work with you. And other than that, I will see you next week. Thanks for joining, everybody.